Okay, it is right at noon, and we would like to stay on our timeline for your purposes mainly. My name is Missy Morgan, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Asante Consulting. And I have a few people to introduce you to, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us. Today we have a webinar, and the title of the webinar is After the Search, and we mean job search. How to thrive and live your best life as a physician. We're going to talk about some things today that normally physicians aren't used to talking about, but they're essential. So the first thing I'd like to do is give you a little heads up about Asante Consulting if you're not familiar with who we are. We are a national lab recruitment and retention consulting company. And we have our president and founder here with us today. We focus on recruiting specifically pathologists, PhDs, and executives at the director level and above, all across the United States. And what I would like to do is now turn it over to Rich Cornell. Rich, again, is the founder and president of Asante. He's going to speak for a minute, and then he's going to introduce our speakers from DocWorking that are here with us today. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, Missy. I want to say hello, everybody, and welcome. Want to thank Missy again for her efforts in putting this together. This is a great quarterly webinar series that we started last year, and we've had some great and amazing feedback for it. Here at Asante, we're committed to offering the highest quality of services to our candidates and clients. We started offering this quarterly webinar series last year for physicians that are entering early in their career. Through speaking with candidates, we realized that there was a void in understanding the business aspects of medicine, the overall recruitment process, and finally, once you've secured your ideal job, how do you bridge that gap between when you first sign your employment agreement and your onboarding and starting your new job? As young physicians entering the workforce, we realize that the work isn't over once you've accepted your new job. That's really the reality, is when the pressure sets in, when you're getting ready to start that first job. Considering the things such as the move, family considerations, employer relations, and learning the new ropes of a new employer setting. This brings us to today's webinar. Today's webinar is going to give you is given to be one of the leading experts on the life skills coaching, specifically physicians. Many years ago, I'm excited to say that I had the privilege of working with the founder of DocWorking, Dr. Jen Barna. And this was before she was a physician. And this was a previous life. And I'm not going to age myself, but that was a little over, I guess, 20 years ago now, Jen. And we reconnected here recently, and Jen shared with me her story as a practicing physician and what she's went through and the stresses of maintaining a work-life balance. She had founded DocWorking primarily as a company to coach physicians and offer them coaching skills of coaching on life sciences or life skills. Handling the pressures of being a parent, physician, and overall creating a good balance. So she was brought together a team of coaches nationally, along with Jen, to hear today on how to I guess handle the stresses and approach is for being a young physician in today's environment. The presentation you're about to hear is from Dr. Jen Barna, founder, and then I've had the opportunity to spend the last day or so speaking to Jill Farmer, one of her lead coaches at DocWorking, and she's very enthusiastic and has some excellent insight. And so, I'd like to welcome both Jen and Jill at this time. Take it away, ladies.
Thank you so much, Rich, for the wonderful introduction. And it is great to be back in touch with you. And first of all, we're so happy to be here. It was a privilege working with you, Rich, back a long time ago. And that was a great foundation for me, actually, in the recruiting world prior to going into medical school and then a residency in radiology. I'm I'm a practicing physician and started DocWorking as a way to bring resources to physicians to help physicians to prevent burnout and deal with work-life balance in a way that can be meaningful for each individual physician. And in doing that, what I've done is brought a team of expert coaches together who've been working with physicians for over a decade. And that's who I have with me today, Master Certified Coach, lead coach at DocWorking, Jill Farmer. Jill has been working with physicians for over a decade, and she's nationally known and has tremendous insights into what works for physicians to help us get back in the driver's seat of our own lives. And so I just would like to also recognize you. Thank you for joining us if you're listening in. If you're a resident or fellow and you're listening here, I just want to congratulate you and also let you know that you're ahead of the game if you're tuned in to what may be helpful in terms of finding tools to give you the best success in your upcoming career and life outside of work as well, and finding ways to balance it all. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So thank you for joining us. And Jill, thank you for being here with me. I'm learning from every conversation that we have, so I'm excited to hear your insights today.
Thanks, Jen. And thank you all for being here. Working with physicians is one of the great joys of my life, both coaching individually physicians at every place from rural hospital systems to Harvard Medical School and pretty much any place in between. I really love working with physicians to help them thrive and to be able to be their best, both at work and in life. And today we're going to be talking basically about some tools that you can put in your metaphorical toolbox to use as you are launching careers post-residency or into fellowship, and to be able to learn things that will work, tools that you can pull out starting as soon as you sign off today, to use as they will support the work that you're doing, again, in your career as well as in the rest of your life. These ideas are all based on a long experience of coaching physicians. They are things that physicians who have both just left residency and fellowship, or those that have been practicing for decades, have said, gosh, I wish I would have known this sooner. We carefully picked things that we knew had the biggest impact picked tools and ideas to share with you today that we knew had the biggest impact from our physicians that we are serving in both our individual coaching, our group coaching, as well as supporting them as they're taking stress courses on how to better manage stress in our digital platform as well. Jen.
So Jill, I'm excited to get started talking about some of these tools. And one of the things that I do hear you bring up as a place where you see physicians make a lot of progress right away is in the concept of self-awareness. And so I'm wondering if you could define for us what that really means and how we may be defining it incorrectly, and how can we shift that?
Yeah, so some of you are looking up at this line and going, oh my gosh, become self-aware. Like, is that the most generic thing they could have started with? But there's a little bit of a method to our madness here. It's not just based on, pulling the most random and benign ideas we can from the air. It's because our experience of working with physicians, Jen's as being a physician, mine as coaching physicians for these years, has shown us that often medical training makes physicians very other aware, much higher than the average population. You all often do a good job at caring for and assessing the needs of others. You're taught, right, to put other needs before your own needs and set your own needs aside often. Often when I'm working with a physician and we'll begin to talk, they'll say, things aren't working, or I wish I could have an improvement or better success in XYZ areas. And I'll ask them some questions around their own needs, what they're aware of they could use in order to improve. And they immediately hyper-focus on their weaknesses or on their perceived shortcomings. So when I say becoming self-aware, it does not mean become self-critical. Often physicians have that down pat, right? You can be hyper self-critical. And what we're talking about is becoming more self-aware in kind of the the psychological definition, which is what are your needs and what needs to change? What strategies need to shift in your life? What needs to be curated differently? What do we need to create better so that your needs can be taken care of so you can do this for the long haul, right? A lot of you have shown superhuman-ness in these last years of getting through residency and into fellowship, and we know that. And it's amazing. And we want to make it sustainable so you can reach out and serve the people that you are called in this career to be able to serve. And that starts with becoming self-aware. Like, okay, well, how do I actually do that? Much in the same way you would assess a patient's needs by listening to them, looking for where it is they're hurting, where it is they could take better care of themselves, where it is they need support so they can be at their best. Simply getting quiet and being the compassionate witness to yourself and asking yourself in the same kind way, not in that harsh, mean, self-critical way we often talk to ourselves, but asking yourself how you would want to be treated as if you were your best patient. That's a good place to start to be able to gain self-awareness and help take care of your needs, which makes your career more sustainable in the long term. Jen, what do you think about that?
Well, I think I would be curious to know whether anyone listening may identify with this, but to me, it feels like when we were trained that we're essentially trained to ignore ourselves. And that's in a way an important part of our training, because in order to get through the grueling type of nature of the work, we have to ignore ourselves in a lot of ways, but that can then sort of be extrapolated into the rest of our lives. And when you're at a point where you're recognizing that you need to also be aware of your own needs, and you become you find ways to tune back into that and listen to yourself in the same way that you would listen to a patient, or the same way that you would listen to someone that you care about. I do think it's a mind shift to even recognize that you have neglected that part of listening. You listen to everyone else, but are you listening to your own needs, as opposed to being self-critical, which I think, we could have a whole different webinar about that topic specifically as it pertains to physicians. From talking to physicians across the country, we definitely see, some patterns here. And I think this is a big one. And that also ties into, I think, that another tool that you have talked about extensively, which is the emotional agility, and recognizing what that is. And then I guess recognizing that as a concept, and then what are tools that you can actually put into use to take advantage of emotional agility as a way to help yourself in success, having success in life and at work as well.
Yeah, so I love this term. It was coined by a researcher and psychiatrist at Harvard University named Susan David. She wrote a great book on it. And she said, we've been talking for a long time. She works a lot with the folks at Harvard who've been on the cutting edge of understanding stress and stress responses and better managing stress. And she said, a lot of stress comes from the emotional the inability to really process our emotions very well. Nobody ever taught us how to do that, right? As a matter of fact, a lot of physician clients will say, I was taught to set those aside, right? Or it's just always been my nature to kind of push those emotions down, which is one often response that we have to our emotions as we stuff them down and avoid them, which is fine, except for then they come out sideways, right? Exploding in those ways we don't want them to. And then the other way that sometimes emotions can be very challenging for folks is that when we don't have the ability to process our emotions, instead of managing our emotions, they manage us, and we have our emotions at other people. So we may stuff them down at work, and then when they come home and they come out sideways again at those closest to us. So emotional agility is very much related to learning how to just better process and manage your emotions. And we do do that by learning a little bit more about what's happening in our brains, right? When we are when we're dysregulated, right? When we're regulated emotionally, we tend to kind of just be in that calm, clear, connected state where we can see what needs to get done. We have full capacity of our cognitive ability. And it's what neuroscientist Rick Hansen, who's written extensively on this, calls being in the green brain. When we're in red brain, that's when we're in a more reactive, emotionally agitated, dysregulated state. And it's not necessarily bad. It's that fight or flight mode when we're in emergency. It's okay in very short bursts. It's just we weren't meant to be in that mode for very long. And so the most important thing you can do to increase your emotional agility, increase your emotional intelligence, process your emotions in a more effective and healthy way is to notice them. I notice I'm in red brain mode. That means I got to get out of the situation, take some deep breaths, calm myself down. And before I want to communicate with somebody, before I want to say something that I later on regret, or take an action that isn't using the full capacity of my, the prefrontal cortex, where I'm going to make my best decisions. So I notice I'm in red brain. I notice that is a really good way to begin to have better emotional agility. In addition to that, we know from a lot of the research that's been done on burnout and activated stress states that when we are in an activated stress state, usually because of some form of a emotional response, we get frustrated, scared, overwhelmed. We need to, when we're in that activated stress state, we need to do some things to complete the stress cycle. Most effective, everybody, the research keeps coming back to it. New research out of Harvard again, exercise. Please don't shoot the messenger here. You're like, I don't know if I have time for that. You don't have to become a gym rat. You don't have to love working out. You need to get your heart rate up even for short periods of time. It helps metabolize the stress hormones in ways that almost nothing else we know does. In addition to that, we know that things like mindfulness and meditation practices, you don't have to become a guru and go to an ashram, counting your breaths, putting your hand on your heart, taking one wrist over the other wrist. Those are ways that you soothe yourself and you begin to bring yourself back in the present moment. Mindfulness is another really effective way to make us be more responsive instead of reactive, which helps with that ability to navigate and be less reactive, using our brains more in challenging situations. What comes up for you as we talk about these concepts, Jen?
Well, I think it's really interesting, hearing you talk about these tools that we know. I mean, I really think all physicians know that we need to exercise. We know that we should know that mindfulness helps and makes a significant difference. All of these different tools that are out there that have been proven to help in this way. Still, I'm listening to this and thinking, as I have before, that it's easier said than done to employ these tools. And I would love to hear about what you see in your physician clients to help them bridge that gap between knowing it should be done and actually doing it.
Beautifully said, right? Because of course, if anybody's going to know this, it's you guys, because you're physicians, you have the training on it. It's a matter of making the time for it. I think one of the biggest things that my physician clients tell me is when they understand the physical benefits of exercise, when they understand how much better it's going to make them at staying at their cognitive best, at their relational best, to be able to process stress hormones and to move through some of these ways of being more reactionary. It's a great motivator to even add 5 minutes a day of taking the stairs instead of just grabbing the elevator, or setting a timer for 1 minute at the beginning of the day, right after lunch, and then maybe again at the end of the day to practice counting breaths, which is a way that we bring ourselves into more emotional regulation in a mindfulness practice. So it's not all or nothing. I either meditate for a half hour a day or I go exercise, I hit the gym for an hour. It's recognizing how important these practices are to keep you at your best, both cognitively, again, relationally, and all the other aspects of yourself when you're working with your patients and colleagues.
And I suppose really the idea of bridging that knowing doing gap comes into the next topic, which is the topic of agency, meaning the ability to control some things versus other things, and figuring out the difference between those.
Right, because we know that one of the, I throw this slide up sometimes when I'm giving presentations. People are like, this slide is stressing me out, take it down. But it's this, it's such a good, I think, visual for how we're feeling when we're in that activated stress state, when we are emotionally dysregulated, when we're feeling overwhelmed. And a lot of times, to your point, we talk about agency. We are overwhelmed and pressurized because we feel like, I need that person to change, which often we have no control over. I need this system to change, which often we have no control over, at least in the moment. So that just doubles the weight of the overwhelm and pressure we're feeling. So one of the most effective things that you can do, and I really encourage people to make this a weekly practice, if you're feeling yourself kind of with that generalized sense of overwhelm and like, there's just so much, is to do an exercise that really helps you to identify, and identify what is in your control and what isn't, and therefore give you the chance to take action where action is going to be most effective and not swirl in that overwhelmed state. So if you guys will grab a piece of paper and draw a circle on it, just like I have, as you can tell, it requires no artistic ability or really any ability at all to do this. And we're going to just take less than a minute here. And inside the circle, I'd love you to do this exercise with me. I'd like you to write inside the circle things that are causing you worry, overwhelm, that are stressing you out, that you have even the tiniest ability to affect the outcome of. And then outside the circle, I would like for you to put down things that are stressing you out, making you overwhelmed, worrying you, that you have no control over the outcome of. Okay, so we're just going to take a couple of minutes or less than a minute here for you guys to do that. And then I'll share how one of my clients used this exercise to make a huge and meaningful change in her life as a young physician. So in the circle, stuff that you have a little control over. Outside the circle, stuff you don't. And as you're finishing up, you guys, if you have comments, questions, ahas, wait a second, use the chat feature. We have a moderator, and when we finish up here, just in a few minutes with some of these ideas and tools that we're sharing with you, we want to hear your questions, and I'm happy to coach you around anything that's coming up with this. Okay, so this exercise, I'm going to use the loosen, I'll play loose and free with the facts here because I don't want anybody to be identified, but I'll call a client by the name of Jillian. And Jillian is practicing in a rural area, and post-COVID, because of a merger with a large healthcare system and a big change in the way that they operated in the operations of their medical practice, meaning they lost some staff who didn't want to transition over to new ownership. A lot of things changed in this rural community over COVID. They got hit pretty hard, and it was a pediatric practice. They weren't seeing people come into the practice in the same way for vaccinations and other things that they were traditionally used to seeing. So when I asked Jillian to do this exercise, she said, I'm worried because we're losing patients in the practice. And I said, well, can you say a little bit more? And she said, well, our birth rates are down, right? Outside the circle, right? She really can't control who's having babies and who's not having babies. And our patients are not coming to us because they're confused by the computer online scheduling system we have. That went inside the circle for her. And it was the first time she went, oh, I could, I'm even happy to fund it myself because it's so important to me. I could send a letter out to my entire patient base and say, I know this is a new system. It may be confusing, but it's going to be so much more convenient, and walk them through the 2 steps that it's really easy to sign on and get themselves scheduled. She felt very empowered. She'd been feeling very stressed out, very overwhelmed, very foreboding about the future of this practice. But by identifying what was in her control and what was out of her control, she was able to focus on on what was in her control and then take meaningful, strategic, inspired action toward something that mattered to her. And it made a huge difference of getting her unstuck in that specific situation. Jen, you and I have done this with lots of other physicians as well. What's been your experience and what do you think about this idea?
Well, it has been really interesting to see what a significant difference just that shift in thinking can make for someone, because when you're in that state of overwhelm and you're feeling really stressed about multiple things, it is really useful to do this exercise. I've seen people make big transitions by sort of applying these techniques. And it's sort of like the first time you hear of it, you're really, if you've never heard it before, it's a big mind shift to like realize I don't have to worry about all these things that I can't control. I can just let that go. And that is really helpful in and of itself. But also then to realize the things that are in my control, I can actually put my energy on that. And so I won't be spending energy on the things I can't control. I'm going to focus my energy and start looking for solutions inside what I can control. What I've found by working with physicians and being in the small group coaching sessions and that kind of thing with you, and is that I've seen people make these shifts that are sort of a stepwise fashion to a point where they begin to not only see what they can control in the center and look for solutions to those things, but I've seen people then take it to the next step and begin to realize, well, out of these things I can't control, there might be some part of it that I could troubleshoot. And then by sort of taking back the power in the things they can control, they begin to take on some of pieces of the things and realize where the line is. Maybe there's a small part that I can control. And I think by doing that, it ultimately empowers them. Similar to what you said a minute ago, where everything is not black and white. It's not just yes or no, or, practice full time or you don't practice at all. Or, there are so many things in medicine and in life that there are a whole array of options to choose from. And this is one of those things that I've seen people make progress in different degrees as they learn to use this tool. So I think it's a very useful tool and a great way to think about when you start to have that sort of pent up anxiety where you feel stressed out, to just sit down for a moment and go through this exercise. It can give you really quick relief.
Right. And then this may be a really key one for all of you here who are just, finishing up residency, moving into new practices and or in fellowship, to begin to recognize, there isn't a lot of agency and control. Some of you probably snickered when you heard that. What's in your control? Because you're used to coming from a very highly controlled, highly pressurized situation. And I think it's very common for me to ask physicians, well, have you ever thought about asking for X? Like what you need? And they go, oh, gee, I just never even thought to ask, right? I never even thought to bring up the conversation because that medical training has sometimes left people to forget where their agency is. But it's one of the ways that I see people regain such a sense of empowerment and purpose when they do that. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, we do have choices, and somehow it's easy to forget that sometimes. So it is empowering to realize where you have choices and how you can use those. And one way that you can use that is within your own community. So building a community around yourself, I think, is another key factor that we've witnessed be transformational for people and make such a huge difference for physicians across the country. And we've realized it to such an extent that we've incorporated into everything we do at DocWorking. And so, Jill, can you tell me about your experience watching physicians and how they can form community support, different ways to approach that?
Right. This came up working with a group of physicians, I don't know, a few years ago. And they were saying, because we knew that the research on completing that stress cycle and helping to better regulate stressors shows that not only is exercise the best, practicing a sense of mindfulness, better learning to process our emotions, feel our feelings, not at other people, but that any form of team or community support. Anytime you feel you're part of a community, and that can be with one other person, a trusted friend, partner, mentor, coach as a trusted thinking partner, or a larger group of 2, 3, 4, up to 50 people. Any sense of connection to other people is very powerful in completing stress cycles and helping us feel supported and less overwhelmed. And so physicians were saying, well, that's great, but how am I supposed to find this community, right? I had my community of people when I was in medical education. Those groups were formed for me, organically as part of being in that. Now I'm going to someplace totally new. I don't know anybody. And I had this conversation with a young physician. She was saying, yeah, I wish it was like my parents. They were first generation immigrants from India, and they had this incredible community of other new immigrants when we were young that became my aunties and uncles and cousins. And it was so powerful. And I said, ask him about how that happened. And when she asked him, she discovered it didn't spontaneously just form around them. They literally took their little kids to the mall on the weekends and walked around looking for other people who looked like them, who possibly had come from the same place as they, had come the same country. And been able to make connections that way. So they curated it. They worked hard in some ways at making that community happen. And so that's what I want to invite you guys to do as you're entering into these new spaces, is not just to sort of sit back and wait. If you're introverted, I'm not saying you have to go out and somehow be this like over the top extroverted party animal. It's a matter of looking at where are shared interests, where are other people in the same season of life, what are some other, where I live, what are some ways you can intentionally begin to form some community? How do I learn things in a learning community by, joining our Thrive group to be with other physicians to talk about how to better process your stress and handle challenges in life? Whatever that community is, if you can be a little intentional about forming it for yourself, you're going to really give yourself a strong foundation for handling challenging things as they come forward in your life and career.
I love that story because it's so inspiring. I think, the other thing that we find, or I've certainly been surprised by how many physicians describe themselves as introverted. I also describe myself as introverted. But I didn't know other people did. So it's something of a challenge, I think, sometimes to form a peer community around yourself. And I think when you're leaving residency and fellowship, you're leaving a peer community, really. I mean, that's one time in your life that you have a peer community basically provided for you, and you're going through the same experience and you have people to share that with. And when you go out into practice, it can be difficult to create that, because it does take some work, and you're building a practice, you're interacting in a new environment, you're meeting new people who are part of your team. And the other thing that I think you come to realize when you're out in practice is, when you're at work, you don't necessarily have time to talk about the pain points that you're encountering, with work-life balance and whatever else you're trying to juggle, because you're at work and you're focused on the, getting through the day, which is typically a very arduous schedule. So there's not time to sit around and talk about these things. And then when you're outside of work, you may or may not be with other people who relate to what you've been through during the day. But I think a lot of us are not with someone who understands what we've been through during the day. We come home, it's nice to shift gears if you're not with other physicians at home. But at the same time, it's hard for people to understand what you've experienced during the day. So while trusted thinking partners at home can be wonderful and really, really important if you have that, and similarly, if you have that in a group of friends outside of work, they may or may not be able to troubleshoot all of the issues that come up for you as an individual. So it can be really, really helpful to have a group of trusted thinking partners, whether that is a group that, and it can be in different departments really of your life, but whether it is a group of friends or family or colleagues at work, or if you're looking for a peer community beyond that, where you can share your experiences from work, it can be really helpful to have access to a community that is a nationwide community of your colleagues. So that's just something to keep in mind and be looking for. And, just remember that it is important to put yourself out there, even as difficult as that may or may not be for you. So Jill, to pull everything together, the growth mindset, how does that tie in with everything we've talked about?
I think I love the concept of growth mindset, which was founded by Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania and the work of his colleagues in the area of positive psychology, which is really just looking at people on the well side of the psychological scale, and it's studying the science of success. The work of Carol Dweck and others at Stanford contributed to this greatly as well. And a growth mindset is simply a way of thinking that allows you to approach challenges or obstacles in a way that allows you to see them as opportunities instead of obstacles, or to crack a puzzle as opposed to come up against a brick wall. The opposite of a growth mindset is what those psychologists have named a fixed mindset. And people that have a tendency toward a fixed mindset tend to be really good at identifying problems and why they can't be fixed, and kind of getting stuck. We all know those people, right? They're good at problem stalling. People with a growth mindset tend to be better at problem solving. And you can say, okay, well, it's just the way two people are wired, except there's now extensive research over the last 25 years to show us that people who have a growth mindset are happier, more successful, more content, and have a higher impact in their lives than those who have a fixed mindset. So growth mindset is a really integral way of training our brains to be, if we want to be successful in our lives. And it's simply a matter of doing what I think many of you probably do beautifully now with patients, which is to look at a challenge, an obstacle to their health and well-being, and think creatively from a variety of perspectives at how you can help them and serve them and help them solve that problem. If you can take that into your life as well when you face challenges, and instead of throwing your hands up and saying, oh, here's the issue, and if only they would do that differently, and instead approach it with a growth mindset. How can I crack this puzzle? What are the different opportunities? How can I think about it differently? What do I need to learn in order to help make this different? It really will be an excellent way of being and thinking to support you as you move forward in your career.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think that from what you're explaining, it seems like all of these different tools require you to be able to almost look at yourself objectively, to be able to step back and retrain your brain to notice something before you react to it. And to be similarly, I think for the growth mindset, it seems that you would need to be able to notice how you're solving problems. And I think physicians are really good at solving problems. That's what we do. We start with a problem and then we look for the solution. And so if we can basically flip that script onto ourselves, then I think we can find ourselves in that growth mindset, but to be also be able to recognize if we're making decisions that aren't headed in the growth mindset direction can be really, really useful. So it's such a pleasure working with you, Jill, to talk through all of these different tools, and we're excited to see if there are any questions or anything, if there's anything that anyone would like to discuss. And we have enjoyed pulling together the information that we've shared with you here and experience collectively with our team at DocWorking to create burnout solutions based on what works for physicians and where we've seen physicians make the greatest progress to truly thrive. And so I just want to thank you, Rich and Missy, for having us here today. And it's been a great pleasure to be here. And I hope we can answer some questions here before we head out.
Well, thank you, Jen and Jill. What an informative presentation. And it gives me a lot of food for thought. We were talking about this yesterday when we were debriefing, and what really resonated with me was that circle, Jill. and the hula hoop, right? And what we can control in that hula hoop. And so I think it was very interesting. I had that discussion with some folks last night. I do, it's a great topic, and it's one of these topics. It's hard to get physicians to admit when they need help or ask for help. And so, any advice to the listeners on how to really kind of approach that when Jen, we talked about this earlier, when you should always have the answers, right? But when you're going out there saying, okay, I'm struggling with some things, life situations, maybe family situations, how do we ask for help? How do physicians ask for help and get through that?
I think one thing that's really important is to realize that you're not alone. And that's something that has been really huge to realize for me, is that, in talking with physicians across the US and Canada, we collectively have these similar feelings of isolation, but in truth, we aren't alone in experiencing this. So when you proactively use tools to help yourself prevent burnout and or deal with symptoms of burnout, you'll find that, especially if you're in a community situation, that you are not the only one experiencing whatever the pain point may be. And also you may find that something that you've been dreading telling people because you feel ashamed about it, then, you go to this group of other physicians and you start talking about it, you realize, wow, like what I was worried about is nothing compared to a similar thing that other people are experiencing. And so you kind of, once you see that so many other people are experiencing a similar problem, then you realize it can be fixed. There are solutions, you can share ideas. And if you have the guidance of a trusted thinking partner, you can get to the solution so much faster. And I think that was a big revelation for me when I started working with coaches. And that was really part of what inspired me to start DocWorking, was to realize I struggled with these things for years in terms of how to balance work and life, and really just that is where the struggle was for me personally, and everybody has their own struggles. But once I realized that I could have made progress so much faster if I had simply learned about these different tools and techniques and had trusted thinking partners early on, that's when I realized that, we as a culture in medicine need to have these tools available to everyone as a preventive way to help people make progress much faster toward their specific goals. So everyone has their own values and their own goals, and helping with a trusted thinking partner that can help you identify those, you can reach them much faster than if you're spinning your wheels trying to get there yourself, but you're really just trying to figure everything out on your own.
Jen, can I add something to your answer to that question, which I think was excellent? Rich, I think it's just tough to ask for help in a lot of situations, and especially when the education has been, medical education has been getting you to all strive and drive for having the answers, right? And so one of the best ways, if you want to reach out to somebody for support and help, is to, again, start with that getting clear on what you need. We're really good as humans at supporting each other when somebody else clarifies for us what they need. The way a lot of us ask for help is by blaming and shaming, right? Either ourselves, right? We come in asking for help by self-criticism and saying, oh, or the other person or the system. And so when we can kind of erase the blame and shame, get clear on our needs and say, I think I could use X. Could you help me think of some strategies and ways to get there? It really does help us get where we want to be in a more efficient, meaningful, and effective way.
And I love that. That's what I'm talking about. I continue to learn every time I have a conversation with Jill.
Jen, I have a question for you. In the very beginning of this webinar, both Jill and Jen, you all were talking about, I think it was actually Jill, but being self-aware versus being self-critical. And when you just present the notion of being self-aware, actually people bring to you things that are in reality quite critical of themselves. For physicians, I'm not a physician, but I'm learning a lot about physicians and pathologists. What do you think would be the most helpful for this audience to take away in that mindset? If most of us come to the table, and especially physicians being more self-critical than actually self-aware, what's a way for them to turn around that mindset more quickly and maybe start adopting that practice today?
Jill, that's definitely a question for you.
Well, I think it's the noticing, right? We know from the great work of a bunch of psychologists who worked in the area of practice of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, that when we begin to pay attention to our thinking, that's where the magic happens. And so when we notice that, a lot of times when I'm working with a physician, they've never noticed that they tend to be kind, compassionate, thoughtful when they talk to everybody else in their life. But when they talk to themselves, they're the meanest, most bitter, nasty, terrible voice that they're using to communicate. And they're kind of shocked. And they're like, oh, I never knew how terrible I was talking to myself. So the first key goes back to paying attention to how, if you're berating, you never, you always, that kind of language that we know is really ineffective in being able to communicate and provide and to change our relationship and connection to others. When we start to pay attention how we're talking to ourselves, and instead, I mean, I'm not asking anybody just, be all like sappy or, ooey gooey, if that's not how you show up in the world. But if you can look at understanding that the voice of the inner critic, a lot of my physician clients are afraid to let that go because they are afraid that that's where their ambition or drive or connection comes from. The research shows us that actually the inner critic can create a distraction, self-sabotage, and exhaustion that moves us away from our intentions and goals. It doesn't drive us toward our ambitions. So the clearer we can get at asking ourselves this one simple question, is that helpful? Is this berating self-criticism helpful? Is it moving me forward, or is it keeping me stuck in my head where all I'm doing is either projecting backwards about things I can't change or ruminating forward about things that haven't happened yet and creating scary movies about it? Can I come back to this moment? And what's a helpful thing for me to think about now that will drive me toward meaningful and intentional action? Does that answer your question, Missy?
That absolutely answers my question. And what I'd like to do now is just pivot over to Rich. Rich, I have a question for you, because you have been serving the community of physicians and PhDs, pathologists, and also lab executives in this industry. In the job search, coming out of that job search, if there's one thing you wish you could tell them succinctly as they make this new step into their career out of their residency, what would you like to tell them? We just listened to these women talk about so many things that can help them with their mindset, but what is the most critical, in your opinion, in the transition time before they even get going in that new job, before their first day?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Missy, and I appreciate that. I think that the most important aspect in starting that new career before you from that transition is to take some time for yourself to get centered with your family and peer group before you start that job. A lot of times, I see physicians going right from residency or fellowship, or even from their one job to another without a gap, and taking a little bit of time for themselves to really kind of reset themselves and re-energize themselves before they start that next position. And so my advice would be to take some, for the listeners, would be for them to take some time for themselves. And I was going to ask Jen a question, actually, which kind of springboards off of this. Being a physician obviously is very stressful, especially when you're coming out of residency and fellowship and working 80 to 100 hours a week during that period of time, and then going into your first practice. Any advice, Jen, for physicians that have families, and how do you create that balance between your job and your work and your family, and what does that look like?
Well, that's a great question, Rich. I think it can be easier said than done, but I had both of my children when I was a medical student, so I definitely have, that's something that I've done a lot of troubleshooting with. I think the important thing to remember as you're going from residency or fellowship into your first job is to ask for what you first of all, decide what you want in terms of your schedule and what you're looking for, and then figure out, is this something I can ask for if it's not something that you've already negotiated into your contract. I think another thing is that once you start that work, it can feel like out of the frying pan into the fire, depending on the support system that you have when you start. And it's important to remember that you know more than you think you do, and you shouldn't hesitate to ask for opinions if something it seems unreasonable. And so I think that, again, in our culture, we're used to just taking whatever is heaped upon us with basically no limits. And I think, learning to set boundaries is something that's a new concept for a lot of us. So that I think is one thing. I think if you learn to set boundaries and you are aware of where you want to set them in terms of preserving time for your family, if that's what your priority is, carving out the family time versus the work time, I think you'll be surprised at how receptive your new workplace would be to that, because they want to accommodate you and you want to accommodate them. It's mutual. It's a win-win. If you can figure out what works for you in terms of work-life balance and work-life integration, then that improves the chance that you're going to stay with them long-term. It also improves the chance that you're going to enjoy being there long-term. So that is a win-win. So I think we often come at it as physicians from a mindset of, oh, I better not ask for anything because that would make them think I'm weak. When in reality, they want to help you. And so if you see them as really a partner to try to make things work, obviously, you already know that you're going to be accommodating them as well. And, there are other people who have goals they're trying to balance too. And as long as you're in the mindset of helping your colleagues, and also having, opening up discussions about what is important and ways to restructure. If you see a problem with something, just think about maybe there's another way that something could be done. That gets everyone into a conversation, and people welcome that often, and they will say, wow, I'm really glad you came up with that solution, because we've been worried about this problem for a long time and no one's ever come up with a solution. So I would just say keep an open mind and keep communication channels open, and you'll be surprised at what you can accomplish.
I had something on my mind just as we were talking. Go ahead.
Quickly, we have a question from one of our attendees, so I want to make sure we get to that. Okay.
Yes, let's do. We have a question from Jeremiah. He says, what can a significant other do to help their partner recognize and handle stress?
That's a great question. And do you guys mind if I hop in with a couple of ideas here?
Love it.
So,
please.
So first and foremost, Jeremiah, that it's a compassionate question, often coming from a very caring place, and it also is important to remember, right? As Rich was talking about earlier, it's never our job to manage our partner, significant others' stress for them, or to try to, we got to stay in our hula hoops. What's in our hula hoop is us and taking care of that. And having said that, a lot of times our significant others and partners we can be a loving and compassionate witness to things that are happening to them, and help communicate compassionately when we see reaction and action cycles that don't seem to be serving them, and creating dysregulation around stress, overwhelm, and which ultimately leads to unhappiness and burnout. I think one of the most helpful things a partner can do is to help through an open conversation where you're not triggered, you're not trying to fix it, you're not walking on eggshells, but just asking some meaningful questions, like helping somebody that we care about identify the difference between just being stressed and being in an activated stress state, and what are the stressors that are contributing to that. Once we, in communication and partnership, can identify stressors, and then maybe go back to that circle exercise of which one of those stressors are in our control, which ones are out of our control, then instead of kind of being in that stressed out mode, we begin to have a place where we can take some action. Oh, these are the stressors. How can we as a partnership and team address the stressors? What strategy, actions, inspired decisions can we make to address the stressors to help the activated stress response not just be a way of being? So ask a follow-up question in the chat, but hopefully that was helpful to you.
That was a great question, Jeremiah. Thank you. And Jill, thanks for answering. The one thing that was striking me before we leave is that we have had some conversations about creating community, and how important that is, whether you're an introvert or somebody who would be considered an extrovert. And sometimes building community happens a little bit more easily when somebody is in a relationship, has a significant other, but if you're single and you're not in that situation and you're moving into a new position, you're a physician, you have limited time. Do you two have any tips for somebody in that situation that, as someone who was single for a long time before I got married, I think it's just a helpful perspective to consider.
We absolutely do. Jill, I don't know if you would like to take this, but maybe we can both comment.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment briefly, and that is I know there's the cultural norm, so to speak, around about partnership sort of forming that community. But I think anybody who is single is, and even if you are in a partnership, looking for ways that we as humans intersect with each other over interests, passions, places is a great place to start, instead of sort of waiting back until something happens. That's, to me, the key to getting yourself connected to other people in a way that helps you feel less lonely and isolated. Jen, what do you have to add to that?
I would say that there are things you can do even before you start that new job. So if, for example, you've accepted a job in a location that you haven't yet lived, or maybe you lived there before, but you're going to be moving from where you are, for example, you can actually take this interval of time between when you signed your contract and when you move there to begin researching and reaching out and making connections in areas that matter to you. And so, first of all, just sitting down and thinking about what you enjoy doing in your spare time and who you would like to be friends with and who you would like to know in that new community. And then taking the time to research that and make some calls and actually begin talking with people who are doing the things that you're interested in and introduce yourself. That can be a little bit of a daunting process. And maybe if that feels overwhelming to you, we actually have a service that does that for you, essentially, where we kind of become the middleman friend who introduces you to people in the community that are doing the things you're interested in.
Fantastic.
But, that is something that you can do yourself. And that's also something that, if you're moving with a significant other, I mean, each of you have things that are important to you in that new community. So it would be something that you both could do.
Thank you very much. And I didn't even know that DocWorking had a service like that. I think that's brilliant. If we are at our time, it is.
And we'll talk offline on that, Jen.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, Rich is about to move, so that would be helpful.
Oh, good.
Yes, so I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you for your time. At Asante, we very much care about every candidate and every client that we work closely with. We're very appreciative of Jill and Jen. Thank you for spending your time and investing in, these candidates who are either moving off into a new job or still looking. I loved hearing everything that you had to say, and I'm sure they did too. We have a contact page at santellc.com, which is our website, where if you are interested in talking more about opportunities at Asante, some of the positions that we have open, if you want more information about DocWorking and you don't know where to find it, DocWorking.com is their website, but we are happy to have conversations. So thank you everybody for attending, and there will be another one down the pipeline. So stay tuned.
Thank you. Thank you both. Great presentation. Thank you very much. Great information.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.